You're listening to episode 290 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi joins us to speak about Buddhist global relief. Hi everyone. Before we begin today's episode, I'd like to mention that this podcast and the supporting website, discussion forums, our live online practice circle, and other services provided by the Secular Buddhist Association are supported by you. If you find this episode or any of the other offerings helpful to you in some way, I ask that you take a moment and visit secularbuddhism.org and click on the contributions button. There are many ways you can help which are listed on that page, and if you make a donation, it's tax deductible and helps ensure the SBA is able to continue the exploration of secular Buddhism. Thank you. We're glad to have you join us in the conversation. For those who may be interested, I am again offering the full Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction, or MBSR program, online, live, on a donation basis starting at the end of April. This is the full 8-week program developed by Jon Kabat-Zinn, used as the gold standard for the scientific study of secular mindfulness programs. As far as I'm aware, this is the only MBSR online live program that doesn't have an upfront price of hundreds of dollars. At the end of the program, participants simply make a donation that they can. To find out more, to apply, please visit presentmomentmindfulness.com. Since the Buddha's time, there has been a diversification and evolution of the sasana. The teaching encounters new people, new cultures, and becomes part of them. Fast forward thousands of years to the present day, and you have many different branches of the same Buddhist tree, each with differing ways of manifesting the Dhamma in this complex global community. A common thread, despite many differences, is suffering and the extinguishing of it. One of the many strengths of Buddhism is how well it speaks to what it's like to be human. And however we show up as Buddhists, this world has more than enough suffering in it. Recognizing that and coming together as kalyanamitas, friends on this journey, is the heartwood of being Buddhist in this world today. Bhikkhu Bodhi is an American Buddhist monk from New York City. Born in Brooklyn, New York in 1944, he obtained a BA in philosophy from Brooklyn College and a PhD in philosophy from Claremont Graduate School. Drawn to Buddhism in his early 20s, after completing his university studies, he traveled to Sri Lanka, where he received novice ordination in 1972 and full ordination in 1973. Both under the late Venerable Ananda Maitreya, leading Sri Lankan scholar-monk of recent times. He was appointed editor of the Buddhist Publication Society in 1984 and its president in 1988. In May 2000, he gave the keynote address at the United Nations on its first official celebration of Vesak. He returned to the U.S. in 2002, currently resides at the Changyan Monastery and teaches there and at Bodhi Monastery. He is currently the chairman of Yin Shun Foundation. So sit back, relax, and have a nice lemon ginger tea. Our guest today is Bhikkhu Bodhi. Bhante, thank you so much for being here. Very glad to have you with us.
Yeah, my pleasure to be on the call.
So let's start by having you tell us about your background. How did you first encounter Buddhism?
Okay, I grew up in Brooklyn. I come from a secular Jewish family, but I didn't have any particular real religious training. I just learned enough of the Jewish tradition to go through my bar mitzvah, and pretty much that was it. But then when I was in college, it was one of the in things, this was in the middle 1960s, was to know something about Buddhism. And so when I was browsing in a bookstore at Brooklyn College, I saw some books on Buddhism and I picked them up. And that aroused my interest, my initial interest. And I even tried to meditate on my own, expecting that you just sit down and immediately you go into some state of samadhi, and it didn't happen. And so I gave up. Okay, then about 2 years later, then I went to graduate school in California, Claremont Graduate School. And my interest in Buddhism and Eastern spirituality had continued through this period. Then in the second semester of graduate school, a Buddhist monk from Vietnam came to study in the same graduate school and to live in the same residence hall where I was living. So I went to see him and I became friends with him. And he became my first Buddhist instructor, Buddhist teacher. And I was actually ordained as a novice monk with him while I was still in graduate school.
And did you try meditation again at that time? And
Oh, yeah. I received meditation instruction from him, as well as the advice that it's a slow, gradual process and that you're going to meet many obstacles. Mm-hmm. Dealing with the obstacles is part of the path.
Right. Yes.
He used to say, if there were no obstacles, there would be no path.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, and so my association with him, when we were living together, then we discussed the prospect for me after finishing graduate school to go to Asia to become a Buddhist monk. And so when I finished in graduate school, that's what I did.
Was there any hesitation, or did this just feel right for you?
It just felt right for me, yeah.
Excellent. Thank you for telling that story. So I would say that you have some of the most in-depth knowledge of the Pali Canon of anyone in the world. And I'm wondering if in all of your work and translations, which so many of the people listening to this have enjoyed, if you yourself have any particular favorites or passages that have been particularly meaningful to you.
You know, it's really hard to select individual passages, individual texts, but maybe just to throw out something, one thing that I really like very, very much, that is very, very deep resonance with me, is the last chapter of the Sutta Nipata. I know a lot of people like the Atthakavagga, the fourth chapter, but I like the fifth chapter, which is called the Parayana, going to the beyond, or the way to the beyond. In that chapter, one finds, it starts off with a story, a narrative, which may be a bit later than the actual original text of that chapter. But the background story is that there's an old Brahmin by the name of Bhavari who hears that the Buddha has arisen in the world, but the Buddha is living quite far away from his residence. And so he sends 16 of his Brahmin students to travel to North India. He's actually somewhere in the south. So they travel a long distance. They travel all over from town to town, city to city, until they get to, I think they come to Jeta's Grove in Savatthi and find that the Buddha is not there, but he's staying at the Pasana Chaitya. And so then they go to the Pasana Chaitya and then they see the Buddha, and then they're awed by him. And then they each ask him a series of questions, and it's all in verse. And the questions are very deep, and the Buddha's replies are also, of course, very deep.
Was there just an inspiration in the story and the message contained in the responses, the questioning and the responses?
Well, what's interesting, this is actually also quite typical of the Sutta Nipata as a whole, but also particularly in this chapter, that we don't find references to the standard doctrinal categories of the prose suttas, like the 5 aggregates, the 12 sense bases, dependent origination. I think not even explicitly the Four Noble Truths, though, of course, the Four Noble Truths would sort of underlie the conversations. But the questions are very direct, pretty much like, what do we have to do to gain liberation? And then the Buddha's answers are always extremely sharp and deep.
So shifting a little bit as a segue from that, what do you feel is one of the most important lessons that Buddhism has to offer the world as it is today?
Okay, one could approach that question from many different angles, but I tend to look now at questions and issues in terms of the common problems that plague humanity, rather than in terms of what can I do individually to find peace and happiness.
Yeah.
And so I think when one looks at the momentous critical problems that are facing humanity, one would have to see that they come through a kind of collective, even I wouldn't hesitate to use the expression insanity, from minds which are completely distorted and driven by what the Buddha pointed out in the fire sermon, are the deep fires that are consuming the world, the fires of greed, hatred, and ignorance. And so I think Buddhism offers a very, very clear, penetrative analysis of these problems in terms of the underlying psychological roots that have to be transformed. But what we find in our contemporary situation is that these deep underlying roots of suffering are not merely confined to individual minds, but they take on collective expressions, institutional and systemic manifestations. And so we have to deal with them not simply by changing individual minds, though that is essential, but we also have to change these dominating structures, institutions, and systems which are driven by those destructive, unwholesome roots, and which continually reinforce them and even exacerbate them.
And I think perhaps more than they ever have in history.
Yeah, perhaps, yeah.
So related to that, and as of this recording, you'd very recently attended a gathering in New York to discuss social action in the conference, Buddhist Action, Morals, Vision, and Justice. I'm wondering if you could say a bit about that.
Okay, this started back, or let's say the impetus for this started back, I believe it was during the Christmas vacation of 2016, shortly after a month or so, well, a month and a half after Donald Trump had been elected as the president. And there's a woman, a Buddhist activist in North Carolina. Her name is Sumi Lunden Kim.
Who was a couple episodes ago.
Oh, I see you had her. Okay.
Dear friend, yes.
Okay. So she wrote to me, she sent me an email saying that she's feeling disoriented because of the election. And she said, don't you think it's time that we form a Buddhist PAC? PAC is Political Action Committee. Then I replied to her, I said, in my understanding, the function of a PAC is to do fundraising on behalf of candidates. So I said, I don't think you mean a political action committee in that sense, but rather a kind of Buddhist public affairs alliance or network. And then she said, yes, that is in fact what I mean. Okay, then almost about the same time, 2 people separately sent me emails about this Reverend William Barber, who at that time was the head of the NAACP in North Carolina. He's now stepped down from that position to start a new initiative. but he had collected 2,500 clergy to sign a letter petitioning or protesting to Congress about the nominations that Trump had made to his upcoming cabinet. And I searched on the internet. I found the document with all of those signatures, and I put it into a Word document, and I searched for, first I scanned down and I could see this church, this temple, that temple. Then I did a search for BUDDH, and I got one hit, somebody, maybe a Zen priest somewhere. It could have been actually Minnesota or Idaho, something like that. And it struck me, where are the Buddhists? When progressive action is needed,
right.
We have beautiful ideals, but we're not stepping out into the open. Okay, so then we contacted some other friends of mine, Robert Coloni, who heads the Buddhist Climate Action Network in New York City, Alan Sinauki, a Zen leader in Berkeley. And we started some initial discussions. And then Greg Snyder, a Zen teacher in Brooklyn, New York, came in. And we started discussions about forming a national Buddhist Progressive Alliance. But we weren't making much headway, probably because the scope of it was too large, the geographical scope, too spread out. So we decided that probably the best route to take would be to start like local units, nodules, and then in time coalesce. And Greg Snyder teaches the Engaged Buddhism program at Union Theological Seminary. Mm-hmm. So he offered to arrange with Union Theological to hold this gathering of Buddhists in the New York area. And that is what took place a couple of Saturdays ago.
So wondering what the aspirations for this group is within the social sphere as time goes on. What do you hope happens with this?
Okay, the way the gathering was arranged, in the morning we had opening talks and presentations. And then during the period when the monastics went for the lunch, the other participants formed dyads, that's pairs, to get to know each other, for people to pair with people that they didn't previously know. Okay, then in the afternoon, we formed groups, maybe about 8 to 10 people in groups, to discuss what kind of hopes we had for a network that might emerge. And each group wrote their aspirations down on these postal sheets, these large sheets. Okay, but when the function was finished, all of the sheets were collected. No definite decisions emerged from the gathering, but the sheets have been collected, and the facilitators are to take photographs of the sheets of their group and then share them with the entire group. And then from this, we'll collate the different aspirations and see what emerges. But in my opinion, probably we have to start, in order for it to be practical, by connecting to issues over which we can have some influence. And, not as a group of Buddhist activists trying to take on the military-industrial complex, but to turn back on the tide of climate change, but especially maybe more local issues around which we could unite with other faith communities or progressive secular communities in order to address these vital, critical issues. So I would say like some of the issues that are quite important in the greater New York area would be persistent racism, even though it's not as severe in New York as it is in some other cities and places, states in this country. And particularly maybe now it's become very, very critical is the crackdown on immigrants, on undocumented immigrants, breaking up families and sending people to countries where they haven't lived in 20, 25 years.
Now, at the end of this, I understand that you led a meditation.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about that, because it was perhaps a little different than ones you may have done in the past.
It's not so different from some guided meditations that I've led in the past, but maybe it's a little different from what other people are accustomed with. Okay, what I did is first I had all of the participants first quiet their mind and just get into their bodies and their breath. Then I had them, in order to develop a kind of sense of solidarity, okay, imagine you are now an undocumented immigrant, or perhaps the spouse of an undocumented immigrant. Okay, so you've been living in this country for 20, 25 years. You have a family here. Your children have been born here so that they are US citizens. You've been working here. You're an active member of your community. And then you get word from ICE that you have to report to their detention center. And then just sit with that for a minute or so. Okay, so that was like one scenario. Then another scenario. Okay, suppose you're living someplace in the oil refinery region and around the Gulf, Houston, outside of Houston, maybe an African-American family, poor African-American family. You have to work in an oil refinery. You bring up your children there, and some of your children start to manifest signs of asthma. And then one of them becomes very sickly, and you bring that child to the doctor, and the doctor diagnoses the child and finds they have some kind of blood cancer. And you know the cause, but you're helpless. Okay, so that was a second scenario. There are two other scenarios, but I would have to think. But basically, that was the way I conducted it.
What were some of the feedback that came up after? How did people share about their experiences during that?
That was the end point of the gathering.
Disperse on this happy note.
Pretty much, that was there was no real time to have feedback about that meditation, because that was to be like the final event of the gathering.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So is there...
Yeah, let me try. Now, okay, now they came to mind another scenario that I described. Okay, you are a father or a mother in Afghanistan or Pakistan, and you have children who like to go out, of course, like all children, to play outside. But you notice in the sky, almost every day, there's this drone flying around in the sky. And you tell your children, you can't go outside to play. You have to stay in or near the house. And even in the house, you're always living in a state of anxiety, because you never know when the drone or those who administer the drones will mistakenly identify your house as the hiding place, the shelter for terrorists.
It's interesting, this shift that I'm actually very pleased to see from over the course of many years ago in Buddhism, where the idea of being socially engaged just wasn't really part of our training. It wasn't part of our culture. It was currency of Buddhism many years ago. That's shifting. And as you mentioned, much of this comes from recent political changes, not just here, but in the world.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, as you look back over the years, do you think this has been a gradual arising of the need to become more socially engaged as Buddhists, or is it really a bit more abrupt and more recent? What's it been like for you?
Yeah. Well, don't forget that I lived in Sri Lanka continuously from 1982 to 2002. And so my knowledge of the American Buddhist scene would have to come from some of the Buddhist magazines that we got there, rather than from direct, person-to-person encounters. But I know, in fact, we used to get in Sri Lanka Turning Wheel,
Yeah.
which is the magazine of the Buddhist Peace Fellowship. So I know that there was engaged Buddhism, even going back, the 1980s, probably even earlier with Robert Aiken, the Zen teacher in Hawaii, Joanna Macy, who I actually knew in Washington, D.C., 1979, 1980, when I was living in the Sri Lankan temple there. Well, of course, there was the Buddhist Peace Fellowship from I don't know when it was founded, maybe 40 years ago, they said. Yeah, but I think, okay, but during that period, probably the socially engaged Buddhists were a relatively small minority amongst practitioners. And the main emphasis on those who were taking up Buddhism, because it was something of a novelty, would be the practice of meditation, particularly the practice of mindfulness.
Mm-hmm.
So again, even the Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh would emphasize that the practice of mindfulness is not just for one's personal fulfillment, but also as a way of transforming society. Okay, but still, I would say that the engaged Buddhist movement might have been relatively recessive during that period of the development of Buddhism in the US. But perhaps it's really taken off, I say, not only after the election of Donald Trump. I would say it picked up momentum probably after the 9/11, 2001, and the US entry into the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. I remember in 2007, I went to the Washington, D.C. It was in January 2007 for a march against the war in Iraq. And there was quite a large gathering of engaged Buddhists on that march.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
So, two last questions, or a question and a request.
Yeah.
One question: if there's anything else you'd like to share with the listeners while I have you.
Okay, maybe I can do so. If you don't mind a little sort of personal advertisement.
Please.
Okay. Yeah. One sort of my expression of engaged Buddhism, and this goes back now almost about 10 years ago, together with some of my students and friends, we decided that it was important to express a sense of Buddhist conscience in the world by helping the most unfortunate people. And so we formed an organization that we called Buddhist Global Relief. And then we took as the specific mission of that organization to help communities around the world who are afflicted with chronic hunger, malnutrition, and poverty. And we started at very small scale, and we've gradually gained momentum to the point where now we support between 25 and 30 projects around the world. Some of the projects provide direct food aid to malnourished people, but a lot of the projects work at the underlying roots of poverty and hunger, including providing education to poor girls so that they can go to school and then even go on from high school to college, and helping women start right livelihood projects to support their families and to support ecologically sustainable agriculture as a kind of counterweight to the tendency of industrial agriculture, which contributes to climate change.
Thank you for sharing that. And folks who are listening, of course, I'll be linking to several things, including Buddhist Global Relief.
Oh, okay, thank you. Yeah.
It's been wonderful work to see. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah.
And then my request, if I might impose upon your kindness with a blessing for those tuning in.
Okay. So I'll recite it in Pali and give the English translation.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. There are actually 2 sets of 3 verses and then 1 additional line. Okay. So I'll recite it this way. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahidika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu sasanang. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahidika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu desanang. Akasata Chabumata Deva Naga Mahitika Punyantang Anumoditva Chirang Rakantu Mang Parang. Okay, so that set of 3 verses shares the merit like after teaching, doing some devotional service, sharing the merit with the devas, the deities, and the nagas or dragon spirits, then asking them in the first verse to protect the Buddha's teaching, then to protect the desana, the transmission of the teaching, and then third, to protect ourselves and others. Okay, then the second set I'll do. Etavatacham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe devanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya sabbe bhutanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya sabbe satanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. So again, this shares any merit that we've acquired first with the devas, then with the bhutas, which are the fair spirits, and then with all beings, hoping that they will achieve all success. Okay, then the single line or single verse goes this way. Bhavag upadaya avici hetato etantare satakayu papana rupya rupicha asanya sanino Dukkha pamuchantu pusantu nibuting. Okay, so this verse expresses a wish that all beings in all the different realms of existence might be freed from suffering and attain nibbana.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Bhante, and great gratitude. And for those listening,
Yeah.
sharing those blessings and merit and the joys of your knowledge and wisdom work. Thank you so much for being here.
And thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.